So we are a bit ahead of schedule. I know we have Mary Rowe coming up and then cocktails, but we'd like to throw it open to questions or comments. I'm sure you guys have a lot to ask. We have some, well, I guess I will take my, as Phil pointed out, the liberty of asking a question to our great cast here. A lot of what we're trying to do needs to involve everyone regarding sea level rise and resiliency. And so much of it is messaging. We have a general goal to restore the harbor, if you will. But we do have a working waterfront, and what MWA does is really try to bring together a broad coalition of stakeholders. So in your guys' opinion, no one in particular, your projects are in different stages, and Tom's, yours is built, of course. But I'd like to know maybe your perspective on how you would actually involve stakeholders, including the industrial community. I think Stephen's study was very poignant in pointing out that there is still an industrial presence in the Gowanus, and there's that tension of residential and industrial together. But how do you actually convey green infrastructure and sustainability goals to all stakeholders, which is a difficult task? And through our project, through Wedge, we've met with the working waterfront, and there's some bad actors, but most people want to do good. But how do you sort of build that constituency of various conflicting sort of stakeholders? And I'd love to hear Tom's perspective. You had the opportunity to build something from scratch. So I think that's great in your recycling community. But if anybody wants to address the general question, how do we involve stakeholders such as the industrial community, specifically to Gowanus, or the larger working waterfront of New York and New Jersey in these shared goals that we have for sustainability, resiliency, and all those great things that we'd like to strive for. So. Thank you, Stephen.
Well, I think it's a sort of larger question, and it's not a question necessarily for this audience here. The larger question is, how do you engage anybody anywhere? Which is not the problem you're necessarily going to have in the group of people at a Gowanus Conservancy event, but generally the involvement of communities and citizens in their physical future and their economic policies is rather small. I would say that when we did conduct workshops that brought together different constituencies within the Gowanus, we found a lot of commonality, and as long as the business owners understood that they could do their operations and get their goods in and out, they were more than happy to talk about environmental restoration and street bioswales and things that would improve their immediate environment. We didn't find a conflict there at all, and that came through our study. But I think generally it's very hard to get people talking together. And my biggest concern, I mean, like Gina, we slugged our way through the Rebuild by Design process at Star White House, and it was fascinating and energizing, and saw and it was gratifying that to get the elected officials out there. But one could have walked away from that event thinking that storm resiliency had been solved through the distribution of these grants. And in fact, even if we did everything there, we haven't addressed 5% of the issue across the city about how to deal with these things. And to me, that's a much huger issue when you're dealing with these storms. We might not have another storm for 10 years. We might not have another storm for 40 years of that scale. And yet, how do you maintain any sort of momentum for the level of societal commitment to physically remake yourself and socially remake yourself to be resilient under those circumstances? I've talked enough. Maybe someone else.
Yeah, I think to kind of address the question about engaging industrial stakeholders, I think it's kind of a call to designers to be more aggressive about trying to meet people that are actually, and trying to work with people that are active industrial waterfront operators. I think it's a really kind of critical piece of our harbor, our way of life, and our economy. And it's a kind of underexplored aspect of design of what kinds of living shoreline techniques or what kinds of ecological improvements can actually coexist with active waterfront industry. The other thing that we've kind of found in some of our work is that There are limitations, obviously, on working on active industrial sites. Access is a big concern, but in some instances, that's actually quite beneficial. So you have to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that different clients or different sites open up. In the oyster restoration world, for example, in New Jersey, the one site where oyster restoration is actually actively permitted and allowed is on the Earl Naval Facility, which is an active naval pier that extends way out into Raritan Bay. And it's allowed there explicitly because it's a totally publicly inaccessible site and it's able to be monitored 24 hours a day. So sometimes in these kind of more experimental pilot scale projects that require a higher degree of security, many of these sites offer opportunities that others don't.
I'm not sure that everyone knows why oysters are so dangerous to people. Maybe you could explain it.
Oh, yeah. So there's a concern of poaching of oysters in non-shellfishable waters that would people would actually be eating them and potentially getting sick from eating an oyster grown in waters such as the Gowanus or the Bay Ridge Flats or Staten Island or anywhere around New York Harbor, which is not open for shellfishing. But the other thing I was going to say, which kind of contradicts this slightly, is part of working on an active industrial waterfront or a waterfront that's part of a kind of active economy is doing more research. We started Rebuild by Design, and through our site research and through our conversations with marina operators, we found out there was an active hard clamming industry off the shore of Staten Island. So even though New York City's harbor is not permittable for shellfish harvesting, a small portion of it is within New York, within the Raritan Bay, for hard clams, where clams can actually be extracted from Raritan Bay, sent to Long Island for a couple weeks. They clean in the clean Long Island water, and then they're marketed as Long Island clams. So this was a whole industry that we didn't even know about. No one had told us. It wasn't kind of actively marketed. It wasn't obvious, but it was a really kind of essential part of the working waterfront that was only revealed to us after that conversation and site research.
I mean, I would agree it's difficult, and it is in part because people are working a lot, but I would say also, the older, I can't speak to sort of new warehousing operations, but the older industries, by and large, I think people liked being under the radar. They didn't, if there's a visitor, unless it's a customer, it was probably a regulator. So it's not, there hasn't historically been a reward for opening up and engaging. It's really sort of keep your head down, keep a low profile, and run your business. So I think that there's probably a lot of room for bridge making, and I guess a lot if the business margins are tight, if there's some real tangible benefit, community goodwill is very valuable, and for us it means a lot. But if you're sort of a business on the margin, that's maybe not a good enough reason to open up and spend time and to try and do something. But I mean, I think there's a lot of room for these businesses not feeling like they're just hanging on and they're waiting to be zoned out of business or waiting for complaints to bring in regulators to bring in fines and eventually go out of business for reasons outside of zoning. So I think I don't know the answer to it, but I'd say there's a lot of room if people really want to keep these industrial businesses in the city. There's a lot of room for relationship building there.
Okay, that was the first question. Is there any other questions or comments? If you have any, please come up. Or we've solved everything. So I guess as the moderator, I have to have a backup question. Oh, okay, Owen. Here you go.
I could ask questions all evening, but I'll refuse. My main question goes into I've just been through a year-long participatory process called Bridging Gowanus, where we've been meeting with community planners. The conversations have been very interesting, and I can't say there's a consensus except for one thing, that the map that was shown on the screen saying, let's just look at this manufacturing area, I think is not the current thought process of planning the Gowanus. I think the current thought process is, and even the map that's on the cover of every brochure, doesn't take both sides of Nevin Street, for example, as part of the Gowanus neighborhood. And I think that the current thought process is when we do think of a Gowanus neighborhood, we should be thinking of what next. So when we have Whole Foods, and thank you for the food tonight or this afternoon, please don't build 70% of your site as a parking lot. Instead, put it on top of a roof that has 70% of the site as maybe a making facility where people are baking bread or making cutting boards like what we like to do here. So that I think, so long lead in, sorry everybody, into the question, when Eastern Effects now wants to expand their businesses, why do they not, instead of saying, well, it's going to be really expensive, try to think of a way to mix the uses? Because time and time and time again, and I think the majority of that year-long conversation right now is let's preserve a mix of uses. Let's not just swap it all for residential. And when we have an office space, such as a wonderful business such as Eastern Effects, you could easily have had housing above that or makers above them on their current property today even. You could put a whole bunch of residential uses or the person that's making the cutting boards on the Gowanus Canal. So that's, I guess, I'm encouraging the designers in the room and the future planners and the future studies to now look at what is the future of our neighborhood, and the year-long conversation where everybody kept coming back to the table saying, don't just color it purple or yellow or red. Let's keep it a rainbow of colors on each and every property.
It's funny, in the prior conversation or with the prior question, I started to doodle on this paper and I wrote down extreme mixed use. So, and I was thinking ecologically, right? And I was thinking in terms of the infrastructure and the idea that you can blend the industrial uses and the ecological infrastructure, not just on the waterfront edges, but also in the upland. And, you know, that extends also to a lot of these highway corridors. You know, there are lots of opportunities for change. But I think one of the things that precludes what you're talking about, though, are some of the zoning regulations that are in place for the waterfront. And that perhaps there needs to be a look at that again to provide more flexibility within those very specific zoning regulations, because I completely agree with what you're saying, and I think that the Bridging Gowanus exercise is really incredible, and I think city planning is waiting for, you know, the results of that to move forward. But maybe within that effort, if you can suggest, hey, you know what, we need to have more flexibility in these rules for that waterfront design, then that would really help accomplish what you're trying to achieve. It would help everybody in the city.
I'm not sure, Owen, I'm not sure if I'm quite where you are with that thinking. I think it works. I find it very encouraging with a certain range of use groups you might find in M1 zones. And as soon as if the city is still going to support or need any of the uses, more noxious uses, more disturbing uses that fall into M2 and M3 zones, mixed-use zoning seems to me like an exit door for those uses. That it's very hard. People don't really want to live cheek by jowl with the scrapyard, and so trying to find the balance going into the future of what sort of supportive service uses are required in what geographic distribution to have still well-functioning neighborhoods with good services that are affordable, and balancing that with attractive communities that people live in, or interesting, dynamic, mixed communities that people live in, I think is a challenge. I can't say I have the answers to that, nor necessarily how it plays out in the Gowanus.
But, well, I want to counter that, though, also, because I think there are a lot of places where we have these infrastructure systems that can be used for certain industrial uses. Like, I have a fellowship from the Design Trust for Public Space, and we're looking at all the spaces under the elevated, like under the entire Gowanus Expressway. It would be a great place to have, you know, light manufacturing or sculpture studios, or, you know, there are things that where you can make a lot of noise and you can make a mess and you can, you know, it can be dirty and you have, you know, good access to transportation. I think there are places like that around the city that are kind of ideal for these mixed uses, and the mixed use may not be residential and industrial, maybe it's infrastructure and industry. it's just a different mix, or ecology and industry and manufacturing, because you could also be channeling the stormwater off of the raised highways and managing through modular bioswales. So, I think we just have to rethink our idea of mix.
Can I ask a question, or do you go?
I was just going to, this may be more related to the sponge park and what Suzanne was talking about. I was just wondering, the sponge park is a micro of something that could be macro for the whole canal. What, if it were at every street end, how much of the stormwater runoff would it actually capture on the streets? And then related to the flexibility issue, I'm not asking for gallons,
Yeah.
but, and then related to
855,000 gallons. I mean,
related to that issue is, if you talk about flexibility in city planning and zoning, I know because we've worked a lot with DEP on their standards, that they only want us to capture the first 1 inch. If you could you design those same structures to capture more than the first inch if there were more flexibility with DEP?
Okay, in answer to your second question, yes, and that would be really great, right? And I think there are a lot of organizations that are trying to capture more than an inch, and they've been held back by the DEP regulations. In relation to your first question, we did the calculations on the entire Gowanus watershed, and you need, I think, 11 acres of permeable ground in order to capture the 1.2-inch storm for the entire watershed. So if we were to actually realize the entire master plan that we developed with the Conservancy back in 2008, we would have added 5.2 acres of permeable ground. And I think what we were trying to do is actually overlap program on with this permeable ground, so you could have a dual purpose. So again, it's like tying into the mixed use idea. It's mixed public programming with functional, or with an ecological function. I think there are a lot of, when we look at that 11 acres, you can think about some of the backyards up in Park Slope and in Carroll Gardens. There's lots of additional land that we didn't include in our metrics because it wasn't public land. So, I think it's actually an achievable amount of capture to think about really solving the stormwater issues of the Gowanus.
And sort of related question, maybe for everybody, we're all talking a lot about function, the functionality and the ecosystem services, and what's the relationship of function and aesthetics? So you can build highly functional landscapes and highly functional coastal defense systems, and yet most people who live in New York, they care about the fact that they're going to be have their property damage reduced or diminished or mitigated or eliminated. But they also want the place to look beautiful and look attractive. And how do you match up those, and can you effectively match up aesthetics and beauty with function?
You certainly can if you conceive of it that way. You won't necessarily, just in the question of stormwater, I'm just going to use that as a point of departure because it seems to be so relevant to the Gowanus here. The sponge parks, the constructions in the public right-of-way that capture stormwater, the tree pits, they're all important, but I think what I'm reading between the lines with Susanna's numbers, and my own feeling about it is that they don't solve the question of the whole watershed of the Gowanus Canal. And the answer to that is probably a whole bunch of things that are a combination of the very potentially aesthetic and beautiful and things that are functional. You get them working side by side where they work best. You're not going to, Park Slope is a cliff hillside with a impervious runnel every 200 feet that pours water into the Gowanus Canal. And until you start to catch some of that stuff on the curb up the hill and in that whole watershed, until you give a free rain barrel to everybody with a townhouse, brownstone with a flat roof, and have them catch water all the way up and down the watershed. And here's the one that's most puzzling to me. is that you probably have more than your 11 acres by far within the flat roofs in the industrial district of the Gowanus Canal, and you don't have anyone who's pulled, most people haven't pulled a building permit since the 1980s. They're not going to put money into their roofs to have rooftop detention. They have 1-year leases. They're not going to sign up for a 30-year property restriction to get money from city DEP. We don't have the mechanisms in place. So, and those roofs could be beautiful. They could be green roofs. They could be biological, but they would have function even if they just held 3 inches of water. But the investment isn't there. So. So I think the Gowanus, and I'd be far more, and unfortunately, just in terms of mechanisms, it's much easier for the EPA to say, and for the city to float a bond against its ratepayers and say we're going to spend however many tens or hundreds of $millions in a detention tank for the Gowanus than it is to have a diffuse system that spreads resources and builds progressive performance against all those private properties.
To quickly respond to the question on beauty, I think, there's a statement that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and I think the Gowanus is a perfect example of that, and then much of the Gowanus is kind of celebrated both for its kind of industrial relics and that kind of being a very beautiful landscape to some. I think that also applies to the landscape, but I think that's one thing the Gowanus Canal Conservancy is really trying hard to do, is establish a new aesthetic for landscapes and what's deemed beautiful within the Gowanus watershed, and trying to kind of help train and educate people that landscape performance can be beautiful. Functional landscapes can be beautiful. They can be more beautiful than kind of purely aesthetic landscapes, and that we have to be thinking in this kind of extreme mixed use way about all of our spaces, no matter how small or how large. I was going to mention, in response to your other question, Adrian, to the kind of question of how do you scale up the bioswale system or the sponge park system. I think that is one of the biggest issues and questions that's going to come out of the recent EDC RFP for the storm surge barrier at the mouth of the Gowanus Canal. This is an issue that's being looked at right now at a kind of feasibility study level, and to build any kind of barrier at the edge of a water body, you need to be able to hold and store the water behind. And it's a huge opportunity to be able to actually invest in and build larger scale versions of these systems, hold, treat, and kind of address the larger systemic watershed scale issues, as well as the kind of epic, reoccurring flood risk issues.
That project presents a really interesting issue because I think the barrier, some of the proposals for the barrier are at this little skinny point outside of the mouth of the Gowanus Harbor. So they're inbound of your facility, right? And so that 11 inches may actually be significant, right? Right, but then the other issue is that the city planning zoning, calls for a continuous waterfront esplanade, and continuous means continuous elevation as well. Or it's, I'm working on the Batcave site, and it's actually, 6 feet higher than the neighboring sites. And I don't know if Lee talked about this morning. Unfortunately, I missed the presentation, but we're having a really interesting issue because we want to preserve it high, and the high level is actually the new FEMA mapped height, right? But if you put in the flood barrier, then you might not necessarily have to raise your grade, right? I mean, I don't know what the rule is going to be, but all of the street ends exist at a mapped grade. So which is complicated, but if the mapped grade is, say, 6 feet, but the existing condition is at 12 feet, when you do any kind of work on that waterfront, you're supposed to bring it back down to the 6 feet. But then the FEMA regulation wants you to bring it back up to 12 feet. So, city planning hasn't figured out what they want to do with this and how they're going to resolve it. And it's going to be a big issue in relation to these storm barriers as well. But when you do want to change that grade, you have to go through a ULURP process. So you're adding 2 years to any development proposal that you do. So it's really interesting how so many of these regulations really affect our ability to sort of operate in these areas. It goes back to the windmill, right?
Yeah, I had a question. One of the things that I noted from all these presentations, not that it comes as a surprise, that these are very complex systems that you're all working with, and it's certainly something that the Conservancy thinks about because the canal the watershed is a complex system itself. And I was wondering if you could, share some wisdom on stakeholder engagement in the projects that you've worked on, because that is quite a matrix for each of you in different ways. And if you could tell us any of your learnings and what helped, what didn't help, how to get better.
Yeah, I'll just speak to a little bit about trying to engage a broader audience with Rebuild by Design. One of the things that we really tried to do for the Living Breakwaters project was we had a number of what you might call traditional planning charrettes, where we invited multiple stakeholders, multiple kind of actors on the waterfront, multiple civic association leaders, and had workshops where we kind of sketched and designed and learned from the experience of those particular groups. But at one point you begin to realize that only a certain set of people come to these workshops. They come to them over and over and over, and while they have valuable views, you're hearing a very limited set of views of people that are available from 7 to 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night and interested in spending this time in this manner. And so what we tried to do with Rebuild by Design was, in addition to that work, also try to come up with and develop tools that engaged much wider audiences. For example, families with small children became a real target audience because there's lots of them on Staten Island, and many of them were highly impacted by the storm. So we began to go to both the schools outreach, but also we began to develop tools like this oyster model that I showed a very quick image of, which was a model that was built by community members on Staten Island in the Staten Island makerspace. And that model making activity was kind of free and open to the public and had free food. And people came and helped build the model and also learned about the project in a hands-on way. But then we actually used that model as a kind of exhibition tool at the Raritan Bay Festival, at a kind of Scale It Up event that we held on a weekend day. And then we've been using it at Conference House Park and at the Harbor School to kind of talk about the project. And the model is great because it's made for small children who can come interact with it. They can take fish off the model and kind of look at them and identify them based upon the information on the sides of it. But also, when you have a bunch of kids coming towards something, their parents follow, and then you're able to kind of have longer, deeper conversations about the projects. So simply making tools that attracted kind of, and were able to be at family-friendly events really expanded the audience that we had for this project and the kind of variety of input that we got.
I'm afraid I might answer this question more abstractly, but I'll try. Public participation can take many, many forms, and we do a lot of it. And one of the first things you have to decide is why you're doing it and how you're doing it. I mean, the traditional public participation of public projects falls on the scale of the public will be informed. And the other pole of that public participation is the public will be completely empowered to make all decisions. Those are very different things. I've yet to see that last one in New York City. I have very few places. And in fact, when you're doing things in public, for a public agency or for a public purpose, eventually, what I strive for as a consultant to see how much we can get the public involved in a input and decision and local involvement in terms of providing their knowledge that people don't have, but with the understanding that usually the agencies, and by proxy their elected decision makers, will make the ultimate decisions. And so you're doing this both to inform the quality of the product, to build constituency, and to spread information. What we challenge to do, I think, and certainly what we did in Rebuild, which we've done in lots of other cases, we try to make public participation, at least the face-to-face portions of it, as interactive as possible. We try to break down issues into a series of exercises or games that directly engage people in the content of them. It has to be simplified somewhat because we have to be able to go in and talk about it for a couple hours and get out, and yet it can't be pablum. So part of the challenge there is trying to find the right level of engagement for each of those interactions. And then the other thing I think which is very encouraging in terms, if you could really start to script a meeting of engagement Sometimes we do this, sometimes not. We've been doing some work in Hoboken recently. They are very much into polling their residents so that you design your outreach and trying to get people at the meetings, and then essentially put the same exercises and feedback loops into things like SurveyMonkey and other. There's some that actually allow you to record and control the login so that Joe Beats can't go 50 times and vote for the same, or at least if he's doing it, you know that he's doing it. At least the login addresses, you know them. We found, at least in Hoboken, we were getting responses like 6 to 10 times the number of people responding on the online surveys as were showing up at the meetings, and they were, in large respects, reinforcing a lot of the messages we heard, but also deepening them. So it's great to do things face to face, and then, which is expensive because it involves you and your people's time. And I don't know about me, but my people usually expect to get paid. I don't know why. But the ability to reach people without being in front of them there are many more tools at your disposal now. The work is really then one of crafting what is the form of the interaction and to try to do it as flexibly and openly as possible. I sort of hate it, and I've run into it a few times. I've heard sort of canned, I'll call it canned public participation, where you set up exercises as if there are only a couple of outcomes that can actually occur. And even when you sometimes have to narrow things down with design alternatives to be able to design your own exercises that allow things out of left field to come in, that things that you haven't anticipated to come back into it. And you just have to kind of be open, and as a designer, you want to control everything. Let me just put it this way. If you don't, you're not going to end up with something that's very good in the end. Eventually you have to say, this is what's on the drawing, this is the way it's going to be, this is how it's going to be built. But the process of going into it, I think you have to be very humble about where you're going to get your information, where you're going to get your influences, how the decisions that are going to form it. And we try to craft a lot of public participation to get those things that we would never learn otherwise.
I mean, I think I come at it obviously from a very different perspective, more as someone having developed a project, and I guess what worked well for us was going to the community early and sort of following up on anybody said, oh, you ought to talk to so-and-so, get a hold of so-and-so and see if they're interested, and then ultimately doing what we said we were going to do, which seems, or not doing what we said we weren't going to do. And if things changed along the way, it was a multi-year permitting design process and so forth, go to them early and say, this changed, and we were just straightforward. Sometimes they would say, we don't want any truck traffic, or we want less truck traffic, and I would just have to say that's out of my control, that's Department of Sanitation. But it was a matter of, I guess, developing enough trust that you could be, which actually, I mean, unfortunately, it's, I would say the bar was set kind of low, because I went to them after a couple of years saying, oh, we're getting ready to open our education center. They said, you're going to build your education center? I said, yes, we said we were going to build our education center, and that raised me enormously in their esteem, having simply just done what we said we were going to do. So anyway, that was my experience, going early and being upfront about the good things as well as the things that maybe were not so desirable.
I'll quickly reinforce that. The other thing about public participation, where you can do it, to be able to come back to a stakeholder group more than once, 2 or 3 times, and to be able to demonstrate through that process that what they said in the beginning, what they said at the second meeting, is being carried forward so that an end product, so that the line of thought and the line of process can be seen from the beginning to the end. It sort of comes down to saying that, doing what you said you were going to do, and in this case, in some of the things we do, doing what people said that we should be doing, and be able to show that line through the process.
And I guess I have a slightly, well, it's similar strategies, but I think the most important thing is to be a human being, right? And to really listen and respond to what people care about and to really sort of try to figure that out. But the way we've operated, though, we've tended to work with communities to generate the design. So it's like we're kind of on the side of virtue to begin with, and then we have to kind of try to figure out, okay, how do we get the agencies to actually understand what we're doing? So I feel like my firm acts as a translator between what the community wants and what the agency requires. So it's like we're playing a slightly different role, and it takes a huge amount of time, and it's expensive. But I think it's ultimately worth it, because hopefully we'll be able to really get new work for communities that need it.
I have a question on a slightly different, well, very different topic. Also, I try to bring a little positivity to the meeting here. We all know that once Superfund happens, and even before then, change is going to come even faster to the Gowanus neighborhood. Like Whole Foods, which popped up, is just amazing. Whether you like it or not, it's hard to ignore that it's a big change. So it's kind of a personal question for each of the panelists. I'm curious if you could think of one place on the Gowanus Canal, each of you, that you find particularly beautiful, that is not new, but like maybe historic or a part of the industrial legacy. And if you, and it can't be on a project you work. No, it could be on a project you work. We couldn't have built it, but none of you are that old, so never mind. All right. So if you could think of a place in the canal that's particularly beautiful in your own eyes, and tell us why, and what, if you think there's a role for that type of beauty going forward, say 50, 100 years from now, is it worthy of preservation? Whomever first.
Okay. Well, I'm going to give another shout out to the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, because my favorite space in all the Gowanus Canal is the berm garden at the salt lot. And it's this, I think it's kind of the future of landscape architecture in a lot of ways, in that it's a berm garden that's designed. I am guilty of having worked on it, but it's not a designed landscape in the kind of formal sense. But it's a small ridge that is along the edge of the salt lot, which is the Department of Sanitation facility. It's an active industrial facility where salt is stored for the neighborhood, trucked in and out, kind of more seasonally occupied, more occupied by the Gowanus Canal Conservancy in the warmer seasons for composting and for nursery operations, and as a kind of home-based space. But the berm garden helps reduce the runoff from the salt going into the Gowanus Canal. It hosts a variety of different species of kind of native, introduced, and invasive species. So it's a kind of hybrid landscape. It's managed maybe once or twice or 3 times a year by volunteers and kind of large, extensive cleanup events and planting events. And it's kind of a testing ground for determining what species do grow there and won't grow there and will survive with some care and will survive with absolutely no care whatsoever. So it's a really interesting landscape. It's kind of exists in this half-maintained, half-cultivated, half-wild, half-manicured aesthetic. And I think it sets a path forward for much of the Gowanus watershed.
I wouldn't point out a specific location, but the general element that I like, I'm partial, I'll admit, is sort of the fact that there's still working waterfront elements. I like to see cranes putting things in and out of barges, not to say that any particular facility doesn't need some upgrade or anybody's perfect in the long run, but to me, if you go to cities like Amsterdam or Venice, that's handing right next to the restaurant. They're unloading the small cargo, barges of bringing stuff in and bringing stuff out. And I mean, to me, aesthetically, I like it. It's economically, I like it, and I think actually environmentally, it's the way to go, because otherwise, if you don't, this stuff is going to come in by trucks. So that would be my vote.
The Carroll Street Bridge and the immediate environs of the Carroll Street Bridge is for me the high point of the Gowanus Canal. I just like the very old industrial infrastructure, the retractile bridge, the wooden deck, and the sort of, though it changes season by season, the volunteer vegetation on the dilapidated banks of the canal there, I think is very attractive, along with the, concrete blocks, cheek by jowl with some of the, uses that have been there. It's changed, and I'd be hard-pressed to tell you exactly what it looks like now because it's been a couple of years since I stood there, and I know everything changes. But that's my icon.
Mine actually came from a boat trip with some dredgers back in like 2000, I don't know, like probably about 8 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago. But the view from the water up to the shoreline with some of the industrial structures that are those big concrete, I don't know, storage containers. The grain elevators are probably gone, but they were so beautiful, you know. I mean, and actually even the one at the Lightstone site has gone away. So I have to say, you know, mine has to be in memory, which is so sad. But you know, there's that. But the view from the water up to that industrial edge, I think, is really incredible. And there were places where, like even when they put in the corten or the steel pilings to hold back the, you know, the degraded wood pilings, even that just has this really wonderful kind of industrial character. But it's the way that the light affects the area from the water, looking up at that edge, that really struck me. Hopefully, at least you can't kill the light. Can't take that away.
All right, so I might have another personal opinion response to follow up on that. Adrian, to kind of start the day off, had mentioned that New York has a unique zoning with the waterfront, that to rezone you have to have public access, and this brings a unique benefit for design in the city over other cities. And my question follows up on this, and it asks, what would you say in your eyes for this, the Gowanus watershed and also for the city are some, well, to back up a little bit, there's a design approach of seeing the problem as the solution. And so might there be kind of untapped problems unique to New York City and to this area that could prove to be also unique design solutions that would set New York apart from other places? Does that make sense, or is that? Okay, thank you.
I do want to ask Suzanne about her experience trying to meet the aesthetic and ideals of the Sponge Park within the New York City waterfront design guidelines. Maybe I'll let you do that first and then share some observations. I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I actually got kind of lucky on the Sponge Park because, well, there are two things. You know, the guidelines for the Public Design Commission, and that wasn't really an issue. They were fine with the aesthetics of that. But the city planning guidelines, we actually were able to piggyback on a lot of the regulations with the Lightstone site. So they actually took a lot of the social seating that was required, and they took a lot of the shade of the tree canopy that was required for the street end, which is actually kind of a nice thing because it means that that street end will have a really beautiful open view over to the Lightstone, over to the Batcave site. But it also means that, you know, there can be this step down and this new kind of wetland area that I think Lee described as well. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but yeah, and so it's, you know, I think even in our description of the idea of the urban esplanade, you know, the rules actually created the idea of creating this urban district rather than an urban esplanade, right? So it was a pathway that would have to thread back into the neighborhood because there were these physical blockages. And that was based on an existing urban condition rather than a rule of city planning, but it's another kind of opportunity that exists on this site.
A disclosure, my firm and did waterfront zoning design guidelines application for the public place site for Gowanus Green Group when that project was still active in its prior form. And I found it rather very difficult and challenging to do a design within the waterfront design guidelines, particularly, and we were adding additional space beyond the minimum required walkway. It was actually that additional space that allowed us to do almost anything involved with water treatment and interesting site water management. The waterfront, the minimum mandated waterfront zone itself was pretty all well taken by pathways, required trees and seeding. And my concern, and I'm going to throw out something completely impractical and impolitic right now, is that my concern is that it's a mixed blessing that the revised waterfront zoning included the Gowanus as a required waterfront esplanade without specifying any different design standards than the ones that are citywide, which are designed for big wide waterfronts that are a half-mile wide, and that they're completely, in my mind, out of scale with the use that you will ever have along the smaller canal. And there is right now basically, while there's ability to get certain chair certifications by the chair with some flexibility in the rules, the expectation is that you're going to be following them pretty precisely. I raised the notion in discussions while we were doing the BOA is the waterfront zoning allows for something called a WAP, a waterfront access plan. And the waterfront access plan is usually conceived of, oh, I have a different arrangement of streets, some of the geometry of the public space is going to be difficult to achieve here. But I was actually curious to start to explore the notion, could you have a different set of design standards specific to the Gowanus that still allowed design flexibility for different projects, might even make it feasible for someone who isn't doing a job with a big margin to be able to do something that's nice that people can have access on a more interim kind of way. I'm afraid that right now, yes, you can have design variety within the waterfront guidelines, but I'm afraid that the upshot is that you get something generic in the Gowanus when the whole thing builds out, if at such time it ever does, which is the other part of that model. And I'm going to change this question. I wanted to ask Tom a question too about, he has one of the things that I haven't been there yet, but very unusual, I think, within industrial properties. The zoning doesn't require any public access for industrial properties. Some municipalities in the Port of Oakland have made overlooks and other things for people to see the activities of the port, but you actively made public engagement part of your industrial facility, and I just wanted to ask you what that originally came from and what particular challenges you've had with it.
Sure, it's not necessarily public access in the way a park might be. Because it's an industrial site, people don't just walk in off the street. So tours are scheduled. We'll probably eventually have try to set up some regular, the first Thursday of the month, wander in from 4 to whatever. But for the time being, it's scheduled visitors. I guess there's certainly a self-interest component to that. As I mentioned, the whole recycling program hinges on public participation and public awareness, and ultimately the city's got to take on that major task of educating 8.2 million people with, however many different languages and transient populations and all of that huge, enormously complicated task. But sort of, we thought the minimum contribution we could offer up would be to, for those people who want to come see, check it out, and take pictures, and that was a worthwhile contribution to that public awareness and public education component. So I won't say there wasn't a self-interested element to our public access program. I'm also just in general. Actually, a surprising number of people actually want to go see what happens to the recyclables. They believe we just pretend and we're burying them in the ground or something like that, so they want to go check it out and make sure we're actually doing it. And unfortunately, at our other facilities, they are in large industrial operations, big machinery driving around, and we basically have to say no, or we almost essentially have to shut down the operation to bring the group in, and we surround them with our people, and to keep them, within crosswalk. So we said, okay, we're building this plant from the ground up. Let's build it in a way that people can come in. It won't be dangerous. I don't have to shut down the operation. They can come and see, and our guys just keep doing the work that they're doing, and kids can. So that was the interest in building the overlook for our operation, so that we could have people see the recycling program in action without interrupting us and keeping them safe at the same time.
Is it open for Open House New York?
It's open for this Saturday. For those of you who track Open House New York, we'll be open from 2 to 6, I believe is the time. This is the second Open House New York, and then we're open for Archtober. Is that what it's called? Archtober. Archtober, yeah, because we did hire an architect, so that's actually the good thing about that, aside from the fact that I get to work in a very nice office, is that it actually attracted a whole different array of people than might normally want to come to a recycling facility. So yes.
I just wanted a quick follow-up question. We start out this discussion with waterfront esplanades and city planning design standards and stuff like that. Did you have any sort of public design review in your public access components with your project, or was it pretty much yours to design?
Most of it was ours to design, but it is city-owned property. We leased the property from EDC, and because of that, and the city made investment into the basic infrastructure, the pier, underground utilities, and so on. Anyway, those factors triggered a public design commission review. So we have been through the public design commission. We basically went with them. I mean, most of the design layout is driven by the needs of the operation, but they certainly weighed in on certain aesthetic things, but they didn't tell us how to control public access.
Okay, I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you, Susanna, Stephen, Gina, and Tom, for a great discussion.